This is the Rat Alert. Civil defense information will be broadcast at 6:40.
West of the Rockies, you're on the air. Hello.
Y2K, how can we prepare?
Stop a few of their machines and radios. Throw them into darkness for a few hours.
We are fighting for our lives. My family must survive.
Oh, for 5 years. 1,000 gallons of gas, air filtration, water filtration.
Coming at you from the frozen tundra that is East Central Alberta, Canada. Streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Telegram, Rumble, Odyssey, and tonight, the Prepper Broadcast Network. Welcome back to the workshop where we create community, find freedom, promote preparedness, and share success. I am Toolman Tim, and today is February the 16th, 2023. And this is episode 556, pretty sure I got that right, of the Workshop Podcast. So how is everyone out there this evening? It has been an unseasonably warm January and February. We're officially on the downhill slope of February, which means, March will still break your heart, but boy, the weather's getting nicer and I am enjoying it. And I hope you guys have got a lot of shit done so far this week, and the weekend is coming. Tonight is the long-awaited second installment in the History of Modern Preparedness series. I'm excited about this. I've put a lot of work into this. This has been a passion project of mine for almost a year now that I've just been kind of, as I have time, researching it, putting it back together. So real quick, let's get the announcements out of the way, and then we'll dive into this week. Hey, Byron, how are you this evening, sir? So first off, couple things. If you're Canadian, especially Western Canadian, keep an eye out for tickets going on sale for the workshop right around the 1st of March. Getting rather excited about that. I can't wait. I got some good speakers lined up, got some more in the pipeline that I'm hopefully going to be able to announce soon, and started doing some research. And just for my American friends down there, it looks like you can leave the country and go back to the country without needing to partake of any certain things. So I got looking into that with an American friend the other day, and looks like everything is good for you guys, just not for Canadians. So whatever. Anyway, if you're excited or wanted more information, just reach out to me. But tickets are going to be going on sale right around the 1st of March. Number 2, it's Thursday, and I would like to shout out my brother Joel Riles from Fortress K9 from the Protection Dog podcast. That dude is a content creation machine, and he's also an absolute motivation. So get out there, give him some support. If you're looking for another podcast, if you're like me and you're like, my goodness, I've absolutely zapped all of my podcasts to listen to. I'm wore out. I've used every bit of it. Then give Joel a try, guys. He is just awesome. I love him. I can't wait to see him in person again, at least at Self-Reliance, probably at Prepper Camp. So go to Fortress K9 or the Protection Dog podcast and give them some support. And finally, we've had a few new stragglers joining the Telegram group. But if you're not part of the Telegram group, why the hell not? It is 100% the place that all the cool kids hang out. Well, really, it's just the place that we all encourage each other, talk to each other, help each other build our businesses, get shit done faster. Today, Ken threw in the weirdest looking screw that I've ever seen, wondering if anybody had seen one before. So I think he ended up settling on getting a screw out to remove it. Just, one of those drill ends, back it out. So whatever. Anyway, I love it. It is the place the community actually gathers and where we make connections. So if you need the link, it's in the description today, whether you're listening audio or video. So with that, guys, let's dive into the main part of today's show. I'm stoked. I really, hey, Arizona Renaissance man, let's see who we got in chat this evening. If you're in there, just give me a thumbs up or say hello. But I see Byron Roberts, one step closer, Arizona Renaissance man. Absolutely. Good crowd in here already. So today we're going to deal with the 60s. We're going to go back, recap real quick on what we touched on. It's been about 2.5 months since we did an installment of this series. And I want to spread it out because it's just, I don't know. I get excited. I was putting the final touches on the notes for this show today, and I started dipping into the next show's notes for, the 70s, and I came across a really cool, hey, PBN members, that Oh yeah, that is the intrepid Commander James right there. Took me a minute to know who members was. I got it. Yeah, good to have you, James. Always appreciate you. So I found this little nugget in Wikipedia today that sent me down this rabbit hole of researching on preparedness in the 70s, and I'm like, nope, just write down the notes, Tim. Leave it for next time, because if not, you're not going to get your notes done for this episode. So here we are. So we started way back, a couple of months ago. We talked about civil defense. We went through the roaring 20s, which was, a time of excess, kind of similar maybe. Well, it was anyway. No. So to the 20s, society was doing well. And all of a sudden, what happened? We headed into the dirty 30s. We had the Dust Bowl. We had the Great Depression. The last year of the 30s ended up being the start of World War II. It was just a miserable time where people, what do they say? Tough times make tough people, tough men. And that's what happened. Strong people came out of that. They ended up going to World War II. The entire country had to go back and relearn the old ways, or maybe they never forgot them. But, in the case of what today is, I think we'd really have to go back a ways. But for them, it was just remembering the skills that they were just starting to lose through urbanization. And then, boom, the whole world went to war. And what ended up happening there was, modern society ended up getting filled with hardened but probably broken individuals, people that seen a lot, dealt with a lot, and had a lot of shit happen to them, had to come back and readjust to society, which was, it was what it was. But you had this huge boom. And then, of course, the baby boom. And this is really kind of where I give the genesis to the modern preparedness movement. It was the, 1949, 1950, when Russia developed their nuclear bombs. So, the U.S. dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And that's kind of what started the nuclear age. But once there was two nuclear superpowers and, everybody in the West had to worry about the fact that at any point someone could drop a bomb on them, that's really what I feel like launched the modern preparedness movement. Now, there wasn't anybody specifically in the 50s that spearheaded the idea of that, but I kind of used the civil defense movement, and we talked about that. And if you want to go back, if I remember, I will throw a link after I do the show to the episode or volume number 1 in this series. But yeah, it really, everything came out of the individual responsibility of being prepared that the civil defense movement pushed on North America, and rightfully so. In my opinion, it's the only way to be prepared is individually be prepared. So that leads us to the end of the 1950s and straight into the 1960s. So we're going to give this a title. The 1960s, a decade of fear, anxiety, and dread. That sounds like the 2020s, a decade of fear, anxiety, and dread. Funny how, the more things happen, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So you had this entire society, most of whom were living on the fruits of modern civilization. And it seems crazy, but, automation and just all of the new engineering that they were getting to live by. But at the same time, people were really excited about all the new stuff they get to deal with and live with. But they also had all these crazy fear-inducing anxiety events that built the mindset of the average person in the 1960s. So just a few of those. And I want to go through some pop culture and some world events that happened to the average Joe in the 1960s to kind of give you a mindset of where this is the decade that the prepper movement launches. And we're going to talk about the godfather of modern prepping. The guy, I've traced it back, it's like going back through, genealogy.com or something, finding your family. I tracked our family back years ago to Francis Cook, who came over on the Mayflower, which was cool. It's a lot of fun, but everything kind of has to be done backwards, and you go back until you kind of hit a wall. And this is where I ended up. So we're going to talk about him closer to the end. I've got something I want to show you. I don't want to spoil it. I'm just excited. So let's get into it. So the very first thing, kind of the opening of the 60s, and it really, there's no better way to understand the mindset of the people. And it was the speech of JFK on a very hot July 25th, 1961, where he addressed the American people directly, openly, honestly, talked about how he'd come back from Europe. And of course, they were very, very upset or worked up with the, how do you want to put it? The whole idea of, East and West Germany. And it was absolutely crazy. So Cabot, just so you know, in part number 1, I dealt a ton with the Great Depression. So if you want to go back, this is kind of the next. So Cabot just said, I think you might be overlooking the Depression. My grandmother, my mom called herself a Depression baby, born in 23 or so, fed those parents into the 50s. Absolutely. And yes, that played into both the strength and the mindset of all those individuals. But yes, absolutely. I spent a ton of time talking about the roots of what led to, the post-World War II mindset, modern society in the 50s. But it all sprung out of the Dust Bowl. And I learned a lot and taught a lot about the Dust Bowl, things I didn't know. It's kind of interesting. I always thought the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl were the same thing. Turns out they're two separate events that happened at the same time that kind of worked off one another. Crazy time. So the JFK speech, he basically says, summarizing, we're going to go down and talk about it a little more in depth, but it was basically, hey, we don't want a war, but if a war's coming, we're going to prepare for it. Simple as that. That's the start of the decade. So you can just imagine how on edge people were with 2 nuclear powers basically not quite pointing missiles. We get to that. So there's the first. Then we had 13 days in October 16th to 28th, 1962. We're going to talk a bit, but we're going to expand on some of these. But for those who don't know, that was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's been books written, there's been movies made, episodes of TV shows, and it was absolutely I can't even imagine. I don't know what I would do. I know you have to live, the old quote that you've heard, like how do you handle living in the nuclear age? But people had to do it, and we'll talk about that. And then, what was it? Just a year later, November 22nd, 1963, JFK is assassinated. So then the one person who was kind of, the beacon of hope and sensibility to the American people gets shot in the head. Then, of course, 1965, I believe I've got the date right there, America then joins another war, which means they've basically felt like beyond all the other stuff they've been dealing with, they've been perpetually at war. I did the math just for the hell of it. But so they spent half of the previous 3 decades involved in large-scale wars, 42 to 45, 50 to 53, and 65 to 75. So not quite half, but 13 out of the previous 36 years, the United States was at war. And the entire world, basically, for half of the preceding decade between World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, had been at war. So if that wasn't enough, if constant war, the threat of nuclear annihilation wasn't enough, they also had the Great Chilean earthquake right in the middle of the decade that registered, you ready for this? A 9.5 on the Richter scale. Largest ever recorded earthquake. That's enough to get the end times preachers preaching. Like, it scared the shit out of people. They thought it was the end of the world. So, of course, what reflects that? But popular culture. Hey, Utah Mike, he said, Dad born in 32, dirt farmer family, had to move to the city to survive. I think of this every time somebody says move out of the city. He had to move to this. I've heard that. In some cases, that's what it was. Like he said, a dirt farmer. That's all that was left. So there was 2 right at the tail end of the 50s that I missed that I don't believe I talked about in the last episode, but it really was the start of post-apocalyptic fiction. And it's one of the most nihilistic books and movies I've ever seen, and it's called On the Beach. Now, I read the book first, and then I watched the film. The book came out in 57. The movie came out in 59, starring Greg Peck, and it basically takes place in Australia. The rest of the world has been decimated by nuclear bombs, and they're just waiting to die. It is a dark book and film where the Australian government has given out suicide kits to everyone in the country, because once the cloud of radiation reaches them, there's no saving them. There's just a matter of time of waiting around. It is a scary, tear your heart out. There's no hope in it. But that's what people were worried about. So they were making movies about it. And so it's like, a chicken and an egg. The more you talk about it, the more you make movies about it, the more you focus on it, and the more you're like, hey, I need to build a bunker. And it's Hey Garden Girl, great book. I love reading it. I read it years ago. It is like it is dreadful in the traditional sense, but it is so well written. It's really the first modern apocalyptic book based in and on the nuclear age. Really interesting. And then how could we go through the 60s without talking about the Twilight Zone, right? There are 3 episodes in the Twilight Zone. I mean, I think Rod Serling was an absolute modern day master, but he captured that nuclear anxiety beyond anything that I've seen anywhere else, maybe in a couple of films, but he did this on broadcast TV, needing it to basically, be a soft PG rating is about the best he could get away with. The book Kentucky was on the beach. I can't remember the author's name right at the moment. We'll see if we can bring it up here. If somebody can find that for me, it's a great, it is very dark. It's all right. The book On the Beach. There's the film. We'll see. Neville Shute. So it's On the Beach by Neville Shute. That's the name of it, and it's a great book. It is. It's the very first one. So then we go into the master Rod Serling, Twilight Zone, and there's 3 episodes in there that I love that all deal with the same theme. Again, nuclear annihilation, right? So the first one's Time Enough at Last, and it's a lowly bank teller that spends his days ignoring his work with his nose in the book. So it's basically the modern version of, hey, I got my phone up to my face and I'm going to look at it the whole time, right? So the dude he gets called into the boss's office. He's like, if you read again, you're done. So he gets his lunch break. He goes down. He goes to read his book in the bank vault. All of a sudden there's an explosion. He wakes up and everybody's dead, vaporized, except him because he was in the bank vault. He wakes up and he's like, finally, time enough at last to read all my books. And I don't want to ruin it's 50, 60 years old now, but it's a great episode. So basically, one guy survives, but what kind of life is it? My glasses. Thank you, Cabot. I didn't want to ruin it. But yes, my glasses. So the dude walks out into a nuclear wasteland, has time enough at last to read all the books he wants. But what kind of life is it? Because there's no people there. The next one was an episode called Third from the Sun. A family, it's actually 2 families, family and friends or whatever. The guy works at a military base and they steal a rocket to escape the planet just before the entire planet is obliterated through nukes. But at the very end, you find out that they're heading to a crazy planet they hadn't heard of before called Earth. So they escaped some other planet because of nuclear annihilation. Again, the same thing. They got away, but what kind of life are they going to live? A few survivors, but what is there left for them? It always gets me. And then the third one might be the darkest, simply because, it's called The Shelter. And it's a doctor and his family. He's got a wife, a son, and a daughter, and they're having a dinner party. I believe it's in the basement at the time. The radio comes on, the air raid sirens come on. They hop in their shelter and they lock all their friends and family out because there's only enough room and food for 4 people. And they sit there and try to, holler back and forth and fight over, let us in. And he's like, I can't, I got to survive my family. It turns out, of course, that it isn't a nuclear disaster. Egg on everyone's face. But again, these guys survived, but at what cost? And that was the theme of all of this was, even if I can survive nuclear war, do I really want to? So you can imagine what's no wonder the modern prepper movement spawned out of this. And then we get to 1962, quite possibly one of my favorite, I don't know how to put it, but this is the day I think that the modern idea of prepper porn, even though it wasn't called that at the time, was born. There's a movie called Panic in Year Zero, released in 1962, that if you watch that, and I watched it about a year ago, Ken Cornelius on MeWe. If you happen to listen to this episode, buddy, I'm 99% sure that you are the gentleman who recommended this film to me, and I thank you for it. It has all of the tropes and prototypes and character arcs that you've come to recognize in a survival movie. I mean, the story follows very similar to just a lot of typical prepper porn books and movies. So I'm going to run it down. You'll get a kick out of it. But first, I want to holler out to Garden Girl, who says it's like that movie with Brendan Fraser. Yes, Blast from the Past, which is one of my all-time favorites. It is just a great film that deals with a ton of hard issues, but it's totally cheeseball, but it has a heart too. So yeah, I love that film. So Panic in Year Zero opens up with Harry, your typical 1960s husband, working dude, always wears a wool jacket, a suit, a hat, whatever, right? And so it's Harry, his wife, his son, and his daughter. They're getting ready for a camping trip. They live in the outskirts of LA. They look at the city and they see a mushroom cloud coming up, and they're scared shitless. So Harry goes into prepper mode, kind of reminds me of Morgan from the Going Home book series. But he's like, all right, we need to leave Dodge. And the wife is hyperventilating like female characters in 1960 films did. And she's like, we need to go find my mother. And he's like, we can't. The roads are clogged. So here's the deal. They see an atomic bomb go off. The roads are clogged. So the dad's like, you know what? We need to take a country road. We need to take an alternative route. Haven't we seen that in 100 apocalyptic films since? But this is the first one that did it. That's, cliches are cliches because they're true and because they've been done, but they always had to be done the first time. Hey, know your Joe. Good to have you. So they stop into a small town. They get some groceries. They go to a hardware store to get guns and supplies. The guy won't take their check. So currency's collapsing already, and they have to resort to holding him up with a gun, giving him the check and telling him they will come back to pay him. Again, another kind of trope, right? They take their supplies. They head to the campground where they were going to go. They go over a bridge. They stop. They haul the bridge out so nobody can follow them. And they end up living this prepper fantasy in a cave in the woods for a few weeks while society... This film is called Panic in Year Zero. I should have had some more. I do have some slides coming up, but I didn't have one for the book and the movie. I will... Panic in Year Zero, 1962. So they go, they chop wood, they wash their clothes in a stream. They have a little battery-powered radio that they listen to the civil defense releases, that kind of stuff. They hunt, they forage. They end up fending off raiders who end up, it's pretty deep because they sexually assault the daughter. It's crazy. They end up, So, I mean, I don't want to ruin the whole film, but I mean, this is a film from 1962, but they eventually need to leave to find first aid, and they meet some soldiers, and they, turns out that they made the right move by going into the woods, living in a cave for a while. And they do exactly what, this prepper fantasy that we're all like, yeah, it is black and white. I love it. It's so great. The son is a fairly well-known actor from 50s and 60s films. The names escape me at the moment, but if you haven't watched it, we'll probably do a watch party, or Becky and I will do a review video on it. But so I'm kind of trying to paint this picture of, all of this calamity in the world happening, news stories, actual stuff. And then the pop culture is mirroring all that. And then let's bring this up here. You have the famous Life magazine from 1961. See if you guys can see that. So this was Life magazine, September 15th, 1961. The guy looks like a space soldier, an astronaut or something like that. And so big letters for those who are on audio only. Life magazine. Remember, this is Life magazine. A guy that looks like he's wearing a condom says, how can you survive fallout? 97 out of 100 people can be saved. Detailed plans for building shelters, and a letter to you from President Kennedy. So Life magazine carries in it at the time plans to build your own atomic fallout shelter. And basically they're like, hey, yeah, 3 out of 100, 3% of the population is going to die, but you'll probably survive. I mean, this is the stuff they were worried about, right? Frankie Avalon, thanks Dixon, and Garden Girl. That was the guy that played the son in the movie. And then Chris Dixon says the guy looks like he works at Subway. Yeah, he's got them big disposable plastic gloves. But basically they talk about making a fallout suit out of like garbage bags and that sort of thing. And hey, how to survive when the rest of the world gets vaporized. This is what they were dealing with. And then 4 months later, January 12th, 1962, another front page article, front page cover of Life magazine. This one says, "New facts you must know about fallout. The drive for mass shelters." And they have a picture of a community shelter built under an overpass bridge. So again, this was the stuff that was in mass media. Whether you want to say it was promoting the hysteria or the hysteria was feeding the news to do this, but it was absolutely all there was to it. And Chris Dixon says, "Put the plastic bag over your head, pull the strings tight, you'll be fine, we promise." Well, you won't have to worry about nuclear fallout anymore if you do that, right? So this to me was, it's pretty telling, the stuff that was out there. And so again, fear, anxiety, and dread, that was everything that made up the idea. So now, they didn't call themselves preppers, but there was a movement growing, kind of a countercultural movement, which of course that's what we knew in the 1960s. But the three, you guys got to hear this, it's going to blow you away. The three main concerns that like the general public, but more so people who were into prepping in the 60s, were worried about. You ready for this? Financial collapse, nuclear conflict, and urban area supply shortages. Those were the three things that everybody was worried about, and people who were prepping were preparing for. Now, you could take financial collapse, nuclear conflict, and supply shortages, and you could replace 1960s with 2020s, and it would be the same damn thing. Now, what do I think about that? Well, I think that the same problems that were affecting and making people anxious from the 1960s are still a problem today. And does that mean we shouldn't prep for them? Hell no, it doesn't. Absolutely not. But I just thought it was really interesting how this all plays out and how patterns go over and over again. But the prepared individual is way better off than the unprepared. So the first one, urban supply shortages, infrastructure. So that really brought about concern for self-reliance. Now, November 9th, 1965 was the first mass blackout that North America ever experienced. So at that point, people had really connected to the electrical grid. They were, living in buildings with elevators, and, they needed artificial cooling, at least fans and that sort of thing. But people were plugged into the grid, and they were expecting to live based on that. And all of a sudden, boom, the evening of November 9th, 1965, and this is what you get right here. Here's a picture of Grand Central Station. All these people sitting around, can't go anywhere, laying on the floor, trying to stay cool, fanning themselves, waiting for the trains to arrive that aren't going to show up. 30 million people, 80,000 square kilometers, 13 hours in length, the biggest power outage of the time, enough to scare. I mean, that was, at that time, would be about 20% of the entire nation in people, in population. So Cabot says, so same stuff, different day. Exactly. So you had a half a day power outage that affected a huge portion of the East Coast, including up into Canada. 30 million people affected. 5:16 Eastern Time, a small variation in power from a plant in Lewiston, New York, caused a breaker to trip and shut down main transmission lines in Ontario. So basically what happened was it was an abnormally cold evening for November. They weren't prepared for it. So there were these, how do you want to put it, safeguards put into place that if the frequency of the power got too low, things would start shutting down. So what ended up happening was insane. Like I said, it was the first time this happened. This is when people started seeing the systems and the supply chains were so interconnected that one little hiccup could ruin everything. So it basically caused this chain reaction. This one little hiccup at this one little power plant caused a main transmission line to fail. When that did, a whole bunch of other places are like, shit, we don't have power, so we need to shut down. Now, here's the crazy thing. I learned this from going home, but I read it in this article. You need to have power to restart power. So if you've got like hydro-powered like dams and that sort of thing, you need to have some sort of power to restart it. So they needed to get fuel to the generators. Anyway, they had to shut down and restart stuff all across the continent to get it working. It was huge. And Most of New York City didn't get power until 7 o'clock the next morning. And that was a huge reminder to everyone that, holy shit, we've built this system, but it can go just like that. So why not leave the cities, right? And then number two, so you had, urban supply shortages and infrastructure concerns, which are probably even more prevalent today that we worry about. And then, of course, nuclear conflict, which maybe 5 years ago we'd be like, yeah, it's probably not a big deal. Well, guess what? I think it is now. So to open the decade of the 60s, February 13th, 1960, France detonated its first atomic bomb. So you're adding another member to the elite club of nuclear-owning countries. Then October 16th, 1964, China did the same thing. So welcome again. And then, of course, there was JFK with his speech, which was pretty cool. This is a little excerpt from the introduction that he did. But basically, he got on national television and said, guys, everybody needs to sacrifice. This was, they were really pushing the civil defense end of things. His language was very much dealing with the individual's responsibility for looking after themselves. He used restraint in word. One of his lines was, we need to use restraint in words and weapons. It was really neat. So a couple of lines in there, he said, we have a responsibility to recognize the possibilities of nuclear war. Without our citizens knowing what they should do and where they should go if bombs begin to fall would be a failure of responsibility. In May, I pledged a new start on civil defense. In the event of an attack, the lives of the families which are not hit in a nuclear blast and fire can still be saved. I mean, yeah, they can be, but how sad is it to even have to consider this stuff? If they can be warned and take shelter, and if that shelter is available, we owe that kind of insurance to our families and to our country. In contrast, our friends in Europe, the need for this kind of protection is new to us. But the time to start is now. In the coming months, I hope to let every citizen know what steps he can take without delay to protect his family in case of attack. So again, you have the president on TV saying, hey, guess what? Shit's going to go sideways and there's a good chance you get vaporized. And if you can't get to shelter, you're probably not going to make it, right? They had 50% of all their B-52 bombers on alert to be in the air within 15 minutes. They thought that the broadcast was so scary, they delayed it until 10 p.m. so that at least kids on the East Coast would be asleep. Interesting side note to this entire presentation that JFK did. It was July 1965. They had air conditioning in the White House at the time, but they were so damn noisy that they turned them off because they didn't want it affecting the quality of the transmission and the audio. Because, of course, it was still a bit of a struggle. So basically turned the White House, the press area, into an oven. So as JFK's reading, he's getting hotter and hotter, and he keeps wiping away his brow. Everybody thought that he was worked up, tense, and anxious. And so in the end, they kind of felt like it heightened the effect of his speech simply because they turned off the air conditioning. So broadcast news would get a better signal. So I don't know what you want to take from that, but it's interesting. And then soon after, of course, this was before my time, but quite possibly one of the scariest moments in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs. And again, I always thought, this is something I learned, I used those terms interchangeably. Didn't really know what the hell the Bay of Pigs was, but I just kind of figured it was like a slur or something for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, turns out it wasn't, actually. The Bay of Pigs was kind of the incident that incited the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you don't know what this is, it's scary shit. But if you wonder why every prepper today would love to have some sort of bunker or underground safe area or something like that, this will tell you why. So, again, you have two countries that are having a pissing contest with nuclear weapons. You've got the U.S. who decides, hey, we're going to put nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey. Can you imagine today if the U.S. or another country said, you know what, we're going to put nuclear weapons in the Ukraine and we're going to point them, or maybe not the Ukraine, but whatever, another European country pointing right at Russia. Okay, cool. So, and if that wasn't enough, of course, the American government really didn't like Cuba and whatever. They were communist. They wanted to fight with them. So there was a ton of people who had been exiled from Cuba. They're down in South America at the time. The CIA says, hey, we got a great idea. Let's train them to go back and invade Cuba and take their homeland. The CIA expected, well, everybody's going to love us. They're going to welcome us with open arms. They took a bunch of old World War II planes. They painted them up to look like airplanes from Cuba. They went in and had their ass handed to them. They were supposed to get some support from some follow-up planes who missed their deadline by an hour because they think the time zones were different, and that's what screwed them up. So it ended up being the least secret mission of all time. The CIA is training Cuban exiles in South America. Castro knew about it. The media was reporting about it, and it was supposed to be a secret. The Cubans fought them off. They took 1,200 soldiers hostage. And get this is the best part. I don't know why this made me chuckle. They eventually traded their freedom to the United States for 56 million pounds of baby food. So they were negotiating for months trying to get these prisoners released. The private sector became involved, and they said, hey, Cuba could use baby food. Let's donate some. So they traded all the prisoners for 56 million pounds of baby food. At that point, Cuba was nervous. Russia thought Cuba was going to join China, or at least, hook up with them, maybe like a Tinder date or something like that. So in the summer of 1962, Russia sent a delegation to Cuba. They said, hey, we'd love to support you. So guess what they did? They floated in a bunch of nuclear missiles, started building some silos. And at that point, you had nuclear weapons 449 miles from the coast of Florida. Absolutely insanely scary stuff. Check this little cool retro graphic out I found. So for those who are on the audio, it has a picture of Cuba, and it shows the trajectory of all the major cities from the Cuban coast where the nuclear weapons were. 1,100 miles to Mexico City, 2,300 to Los Angeles, 28 to Seattle, 1,300 to New York. In other words, the entire continent could be destroyed with the missiles that were sitting there. They had a whole bunch of R-12 Russian nukes that had from launch to first strike 4 minutes. It was a literal doomsday clock. For 13 days, they sat there. Nobody knew it was going to happen. Everybody figured the world was going to end. There's, again, movies and TV shows about this. It's an insane proposition to even think that the people had to deal with it. So they get into negotiations, 13 days, and finally they say, okay, we'll remove the bombs if the U.S. agrees to never invade Cuba again. And the world breathes a collective sigh of relief. They both step back from the collective pissing contest that they're having, and they go back to the Cold War. But, so, like I said, if supply systems and infrastructure collapsing wasn't enough, if the nuclear war wasn't enough, in the 1960s, the next biggest fear was the fear of financial collapse. It was insane. There was hyperinflation. Again, sounds awfully familiar to the 2020s, doesn't it? From 1965 to 1970, consumer price index rose 23.7%. That was 4.25% inflation every year, more than double. And if anybody wants to know why that happened, basically, Lyndon B. Johnson caused recession by some, liberal policies of overspending. So he had the term the Great Society, which was very similar to the FDR New Deal that we talked about in the previous episode, the 1930s. Basically, make work projects. Let's make society better at the expense of a rising debt, a rising deficit, and spending more tax dollars. Did he have, pure motivations in his heart for this? I don't know. But either way, that was what he wanted to do. And he spent the United States into a bad financial position at that time. And then, of course, they're like, hey, I know what'll help. Let's go to war. So they end up going to Vietnam and spending a metric shit ton of money. And then at the very, very end of the decade, actually 1971, but this was rumored to be coming for quite some time. You end up having Nixon eliminating the gold standard. So they ended up taking a hard currency, a dollar that was linked to a tangible asset like gold, and they turned it into a fiat currency, which was backed by something esoteric, let's put it that way. So all of that meant that at the time, Americans and North Americans were at an all-time low in trust of the financial systems and the government's ability to handle it. So you had systems collapse, financial ruin, and nuclear war, all three over the head of all these people. And so the birth of modern preparedness starts with the person that I'm going to call the godfather of modern prepping, a gentleman named Don Stevens. And if you haven't heard of him, it's totally okay, because I hadn't heard of him before I started researching the last episode. Now, again, I told you guys in last episode, the first time that the word prepper was ever used to describe somebody into preparedness was in late 1999, somewhere in between May and October. That's the earliest reference I could find in any online forums. Kind of an interesting thing. But they had other names throughout the decades. And in the 1960s, a gentleman named Don Stevens coined the term retreater, R-E-T-R-E-A-T-E-R. And it was kind of a play on two words. First, it was retreating from all the societal norms, stepping away from everything that everybody expected of you, basically getting away from all the normal to be happier. But it was also about building a physical retreat, a haven that you could go to, that you could enjoy. It's the craziest thing, like our modern bug out location. And so you have all these hippies that are, the back to the land, kind of free love, down with the man. Well, that same sentiment was coming out of these libertarian-minded folk, whom Don Stevens was a staunch libertarian, pulling away from society as well, looking to build these self-sufficient properties out in the countryside called retreats, and the media or himself, whatever, end up being tagged retreater. It's one of the coolest things. I loved it. So track it all back, and this is the guy. So in the 1960s, Don Stevens popularized the term retreater to describe those in the survivalist movement who are making preparations to avoid conflict by leaving populated areas for a pre-established remote survival retreat when or if survival broke down. So replace the word retreater with prepper, replace the word pre-established remote survival retreat with bug out location, and you have the modern 2023 prepper. It's pretty cool. Now, the dude wasn't just into that. He was into off-grid technologies. I learned quite a bit from digging into him, but he explored things like active solar, passive solar, active and passive solar heating, earth integrated design, earth shelters, if you've heard of those, of course. And we're going to talk about his coolest technology. He called it geosolar heating. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever made this joke, but of course, typical dad joke, but I always say to my wife, you know what I would love to be able to do? I would love to be able to bottle the heat in the summertime and then heat the house with it in the winter. Well, this dude was literally, man, I hate that word literally, but it works in this case. Where his mouth was. He lived till around 2012 in Washington State, built an off-grid retreat that did this exact thing. And basically what they did was they would pack 3 feet of compacted soil all the way around the foundation. They would have solar thermal siphon panels on the roof, and they would pump them down through this absolute incredible. So, okay, it's so hard to explain. I could do a whole episode on this, but basically it's a combination of in-floor heat, geothermal, thermal mass, solar, and he basically pumps it down, and it takes 3 to 4 years of all this stuff to build a thermal mass into the ground. But once it does, it will hold its heat basically permanently, and then that heat is pumped through the floor. So he's got geothermal, in-floor heating, solar, this whole system that basically is free. Cabot, thank you. He says, wow, Tim, your research is impressive. This is one of my babies, one of my passions. And who knows? I'm going to keep expanding on this, but I love it. I think it's neat. I think it's important that we all know where we came from, right? Because, say, for instance, you are a Scientologist and you don't know where your roots are. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, my roots are from a science fiction author that really had no specific training. Anyway, I'm not shitting on Scientologists if you're one of them out there. But what I'm saying is you better damn well know where your roots are, because that's the foundation that everything came after it was built on. And what I discovered in this is that it's a very firm and sound foundation that really reflects what we are 60 years later. So it's neat. But so yeah, he called it annualized geosolar. Now, this I want to share with you guys an article. I want to show you something. Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. But so this Don Stevens in 1976, he wrote an article in Reason magazine, and it was called, the title of tonight's episode, In Defense of Retreats. I thought it was such a funny play on words because, a retreat really isn't a defense, but he's defending the idea of retreats. It was kind of cool. So I want to read you 2 or 3 little excerpts from his mindset. And just so you get this idea, this was written in 1976. And he's referring to a time around 1964. He says, over 12 years ago, my wife Barbie and I decided this country was headed for trouble that might well result in a complete breakdown of economic, political, and social structure. Again, something we're all very much concerned about today. How much more prescient it was in 1964, 60 years ago. Added to all of that, we have become increasingly concerned with the vulnerability of domestic and international food supplies, global population trends, their consequences, environmental decay, and the depletion of fossil fuels on which the industry and transportation have become so dependent. Again, you could take that paragraph, put it in a survival forum today, and it would sound exactly like a modern person. So they're like, well, we kind of felt lost. We felt like we had no purpose. So what did we do? We briefly became involved with political and educational promotion of libertarian concepts, even to the establishment of new countries based on them. So they're like, okay, we feel lost. We feel like the world's going to hell in a handbasket. So what can we do? Political activism. Anyway, that's what they planned on. And a lot of people do. A lot of people, when they're heading down the anarcho or the prepper mindset, they stop off in libertarian politics and realize that it's no better than any of the rest, right? So he's like, guess what? Didn't work. He said, none of these gave us the sense of personal control and freedom we sought. We concluded that we could much more profitably invest our time in seeking immediately rewarding intricacies in the existing society. In other words, enjoy the comforts of modern society. Imperfect though it is. So in other words, what we're going to do is we're going to enjoy society, but at the same time, we're going to ensure against the uncertainties of the future by establishing a remote, self-sufficient haven to which we could repair, an old-fashioned word for bug out, should conditions in populated areas become too hazardous. Hence, we started preparing our retreat. 1964, that's the time it was written. Now, this next paragraph is what, to me, defines the fact that Don Stevens in the mid-60s is the godfather of modern prepping. This is really cool. I love digging this out. It was not our intent to make retreating, replace that with prepping, a business. We were only in it for our own peace of mind. But the word soon got around, and before long, others who had arrived at similar conclusions were seeking our advice in the preparation of their havens. Replace that with bug out retreats. We recognized a developing market, and 12 years later, were devoted full time to retreat. So They started prepping in 1964. Soon after, other people said, hey, you look like you've got a good thing going there. We'd like to learn. And so people came to them. They shared their knowledge. They shared their passions, everything they'd learned along the way. They become evangelists of the modern prepping movement. And over the next 12 years, when they wrote this article in 1976, they had become the foremost authority in retreating, which became modern day prepping. Really, really cool. He ended up writing a bunch of books. He wrote The Survivor's Primer and updated Retreater's Bibliography. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. He wrote a book called Personal Protection Here and Now, and another one called Retreating on a Shoestring. I would love to get my hands on that one. That one sounds really, really cool. So you had this guy who wanted to separate himself from society. He ends up hooking up with a gentleman named Harry Brown. Now, if you've been around politics for a little while, you know this individual, Harry Brown, ended up running as the Libertarian candidate for the presidential election in 1996 and 2000. So he, around 1967, was running presentations, in-person presentations, where he would travel around talking about the need to invest in gold, how to look after your finances when the systems collapse. He was very much convinced that something bad was going to happen, and he started giving lectures in 1967. And he wrote a pamphlet at the time called How You Can Profit from the Coming Devaluation of Currency. Wrote that in 1967. 4 years later, what happened? The devaluation of the American dollar when it was pulled away from the gold standard. So Harry Brown is giving these lectures. Don Stevens is like, hey, you're a cool dude. I like this. Let's team up. So they are traveling around doing these presentations. Harry Brown was talking about these seminars, how to survive a monetary collapse. And Don Stevens, who is an author, put together the very first prepping manual called The Survivor's Retreat. Check this out. The Survivor's Retreat and Updated Retreater's Bibliography. This one is a first edition from 1976. This was the reprinted one. I don't have the 1967 one yet, but this is basically the prepper's manual that he was handing out. It is really, I wish I could show you. I'm going to do some scanning and stuff, but it looks like it was done on a typewriter. The first 30 pages or so are just like practical prepping advice. It's one of the coolest things ever. And then the next 60 to 70 pages is page after page of 1960s references for books that you could order, things like how to fix engines, how to can food. It was an entire library in your hand that he was giving out at all of these seminars. Hey, if you want to retreat from society, here's the handbook and how to do it. The dude literally wrote the handbook on prepping, the godfather and the handbook author of it. So this is the start of my collection of modern preparedness historical artifacts. I have more. I'm going to show you them in more episodes coming up. I've got some more coming in the mail that I'm really excited about. But who knows? Maybe someday I'll open a prepping museum. But so this Harry Brown's teaching these seminars all about surviving the coming economic collapse. He ends up becoming a huge deal in the investment mindset, the investment world. So he pushed the concept. He simplified it over the years. He called it the permanent portfolio. Say that 10 times fast. Basically, it's a four-way split, a four-way even split of stocks, bonds, cash, and gold. So this dude was recommending that you had 25% of your net worth in gold. That's way more than anybody I've ever heard recommend. But he ended up, over his entire life, he ended up dying around 2010. What he earned from the stock market, that four-way split portfolio, was just as good as the Dow Jones in returns. So he did pretty good on that. He wrote a book called How You Can Profit from the Coming Devaluation in 1970. Couple of cool quotes from this Harry Brown, who is a staunch libertarian. He said, government is force, pure and simple. There's no way to sugarcoat it. And because government is force, It will attract the worst elements of society, people who want to use government to avoid having to earn their living and to avoid having to persuade others to accept their ideas voluntarily. Crazy. Yeah, I mean, that's what we say now. Now, here's the next one. And this is another great quote that we all live by at this point. It says, the police can't stop an intruder, a mugger, or a stalker from hurting you. They can only pursue him after he has hurt or killed you. Protecting yourself from harm is your responsibility, and you are far less likely to get hurt in a neighborhood of gun owners than one of disarmed citizens, even if you don't own a gun yourself. So the dude was a libertarian who thought government attracted the worst of the worst in society, and he also said that each individual was responsible for their own protection and preparations. Imagine that. Mind-blowing. Something that's a new concept to most people that's been around as long as, people have been around. The dude was a hard money supporter. He backed the need to have 50% of your income in cash and precious metals. So between him, it was basically the old time. Yeah, thanks, Red Flyer Media, said great quote and commentary. So you had Don Stevens, who was passionate, who was scared to death that something bad was going to happen in modern society. And he's like, honey, talking to his wife, Barbie, we need to get ourselves a retreat out of town. So they did that. They ended up becoming known as retreaters, pull themselves out of society to survive whatever bad shit might come their way. He did that. He ends up making friends with Harry Brown. How they met, I couldn't find. Basically just that at some point in the mid to late 60s, they started, doing these presentations together. So you have Don Stevens, who wrote the book on prepping, the original textbook. I mean, this thing looks and feels like some of these thin religious books that I've been given from different people over the years. It's crazy. It's just, in the front, it's like the gospel, and then in the back, it's all the references. It's a cool book. I'll probably bring some of this with me when I go to the States, just to kind of, so if people want to see it. So then he meets up with Harry Brown, who's talking about, hey, you need to not only protect your physical area, whether it be your body or your bug out location, but you also need to protect your portfolio, and you need to have hard currency. So you have these two evangelists, Don Stevens comes first and Harry Brown comes second, and they end up spurring on a bunch of really cool individuals into the 70s, even more into the 80s. Then, I mean, you guys know where we're going to head, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So that is the look at modern preparedness in the 1960s. So what do we have to look forward to in the 70s? I'm pretty excited. I figured I'd give you a couple of quick little teasers before we moved on. But I found something that, anyway, let's go into this. But so in the 70s, we're going to look at when they changed. So we went from the 50s in a civil defense, just getting used to living in a nuclear age mindset, to the 60s with everybody wanting to leave society, the retreaters movement, into the 70s, which became the idea of retreaters turned more into a slightly militant stance into the idea of survivalism. So people were called survivalists. We'll talk about that. We had a gentleman that kind of took up or went along with Harry Brown. His name's Howard Ruff. He was looking toward economic collapse and preparing yourself for it. You had your first gun nut in the prepper culture, firearms guru, and now we're getting to more modern times, but he went by Colonel Jeff Cooper. He was a specialist in both firearms and on hardening retreats. So he started building on what the foundation Don Stevens laid. Jeff Cooper talked about defending it and building it up to protect it. And then a guy I'm super stoked to talk about, and I got some things to show you from him, Kurt Saxon. He wrote a newsletter. Of course, newsletters, literal mail letters that went out to people, called, it looked like a tabloid magazine. It was kind of, the bigger size they used to make, called The Survivor. It is a treasure trove of 1970s prepper knowledge. It's incredible. I cannot wait to talk about that. And then just as I was finishing up today, I found this incredible gem that I almost started following down a rabbit hole, and I'm not going to do it yet. But in the 1970s, the very first BBS, the bulletin board systems, and survival forums of the earliest computers, the earliest home computers, were launched. And I found these two little notes. One was Survival Bill, Survival and Bushcraft Prepper Forums. And the other one is an article from Forbes magazine in 1985. And it says, BBS offers, this was, I got to backtrack just a little bit because I have the article here somewhere and I lost it. It's from the 1970s. Basically, it's a front page article on a computer magazine talking about BBS forums for survivalists in the late 70s. It's pretty cool. I can't wait to, Cabot Porter says, same Jeff Cooper that did personal self-defense. Absolutely. So we're getting closer and closer to the modern day mindset. People we actually, number one, people who are still alive that maybe someday I could interview. But we get into the 1980s and we deal with guys like Mel Tappan. If you've heard of him before, Mel Tappan on guns, I'm excited about that. But yeah, that's the dude, Jeff Cooper. So that's where we're heading. You know, it could be 2 or 3 months before I do another episode like this. I just have to be honest with you. It's kind of, I have to fill in some time to just, it has to percolate in my brain. I have to work it around to create this kind of narrative that follows a thread, a narrative thread where I can tie all these individuals and interesting stories together so that it makes sense, so that we can go from 1969 to 1979 and go into the great 80s and figure out, hey, this is the thread that modern preparedness followed through the 70s. So I'm stoked. I can't wait. What do we got coming up this week, guys? Well, first off, if you got any questions or anything, throw them out there. This has thank you for coming in and listening to my passion, because I can't wait to do the next one. Probably who knows, maybe we'll turn this into a book someday or a video series. I don't know what we'll do with it, but there's so much information that I don't want lost, that I want to be able to share with the next generation of preppers, because it's all shit I'm discovering as I go along. And I'm like a little kid at Christmas time, unwrapping these little things. And when I came across that little tiny footnote in Wikipedia this week or today, talking about the BBS forums and, prepper forums and that sort of thing from the 1970s, I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait to go down that rabbit hole. So we'll get there. But tomorrow night, I got Mrs. Cook coming on, Mrs. Toolman. We're going to do our next edition of the Last of Us recap. This should be episode 6, or episode 5. Anyway, you guys will know. It'll be there. I've already got the placeholder for it. Saturday night, I'm going to do an episode on prepping, preparedness situations we've dealt with as a family over the last 18 months, the lessons we've learned, the flub ups we've done, the patting on the back we can do, everything we've learned from it. Because I realized we've had a lot of that shit happen. And then Sunday is the next edition of Workshop Radio from 3 o'clock till 7 o'clock Mountain Time. We've got 12 different content creators who have submitted 15-minute segments all around prepping and self-reliance and that sort of thing. We have got, let's see who, okay. You know what? We only got a few days, so we might as well start talking about it. But we've got Brian Alexovich. We've got we got Nate and Aaron from Two Chicks Homestead. I've got Ken Ash. But we've also got some new people that are coming in that are really exciting. I got Jester from the It's Doomsday podcast is going to be on. I have Dave Jones, the NBC guy, who has submitted something. John Willis, give me another awesome 15-minute segment. Jack Spirko has provided a 15-minute segment for this. Tag from Life Done Free has given us a 15-minute segment for this. And Paul Wheaton, thanks to Nicole Sauce, has got us a 15-minute segment to be in here. And Pug himself, John Pugliano, has supplied a 15-minute segment. So I hope I didn't forget anybody. I hope you guys are stoked to hear this. But again, remember, the tagline is Workshop Radio, the soundtrack to getting shit done. It's going to be 4 hours. It's going to be playing. I want you guys to just let it play, listen to the awesome creators. And the cool thing we're going to do is Nicole and I are going to live host it. So these 15-minute segments are going to be pre-recorded. They're going to play just like we did on New Year's Eve. But then we're going to come on and do live 5-minute segments in between, just like real talk radio. So I'm going to try my damnedest to keep talk radio alive. Maybe we'll have to rename it from Workshop Podcast to Workshop Radio, but I'm excited. This is going to be fun. We're going to try to do this 4-hour thing quarterly, maybe, every 2 to 3 months. I think it's just enough. And again, I don't know how often I share this with you, but it's my show, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes and share it. But my individual vision, that is on Sunday, this Sunday. So this Sunday, if somebody can, let's see if we can bring it up here for you. This Sunday, the 19th of February, 3 o'clock Mountain Time, 3 to 7, 4 hours. It's going to be live on my YouTube channel and on Nicole Sauce's Living Free in Tennessee channel. So ever since I started creating content in the prepper sphere, I've noticed, and I've used this term, there's a ton of disparate, however you want to pronounce it, preparedness groups. They're all over the place. They're all incredible people who all have a different focus or a different bent towards something. We've got all these preppers and homesteaders and self-reliance people on the left, on the right, and outside the whole system like most of us friggin' anarchists are. But none of us have maybe connected, or, you got Prepper Broadcast Network, you have PrepperNet, you have the Extended Survival Podcast family. You got Diane, who introduced me, the apartment prepper, who introduced me to all these other prepping content creators that all had their own communities, like Lee, the Cold War prepper. And so my goal, my passion, my existence in being a content creator in the prepper sphere is to bring all of those communities together. And that is what I'm doing my damnedest to do. Chuck Peoples just showed up just as we're finishing. So good to have you, brother. Next Sunday, Chuck's going to be on. But so like I said, maybe I need a mission statement for this, but I'm always trying to reach out to people outside into other prepper communities and that sort of thing. And like, hey, come in here, join this, because they're all good people, support everybody. We're going to learn from everyone. So it's going to be fun to do. Like I said, we've got this time, just for instance, I brought Dave, the NBC guy, on from the Prepper Broadcast Network, which is great. And we got Jack Spirko, of course. Then we got Paul Wheaton coming in. And then Jester from the It's Doomsday podcast. He has his own crew of people. So why can't we be this great big interconnected? Doesn't mean we all have to agree. It just means that the things that are important to us are what we agree on, and we don't worry about all that other shit that doesn't matter. So then we can share knowledge, encourage one another, and there's power in numbers as much as we don't want to think about it, right? So that's what I'm shooting toward, and that's what this is becoming, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. I'm going to go to new events like the Thrivalist Fair this year in Washington State that I'd never been to ever. I don't know anybody there. The couple who run it heard me at Prepper Camp, and they're like, hey, we'd love to have you here. So that's what I want to do. And then the coolest thing ever happened to me this week. The local librarian of the town gave me a message on Facebook, and she said, hey, Tim, I'm worried about the food system. And, she was like, I think that our food supply system is really fragile. And I'm wondering, she goes, I heard you have some sort of log thing. And I'm like, sure. Yeah, that's what I have. It's cool. She said, I'm wondering if you'd like to come to the library and do a presentation for the community on preparing for food shortages. And I said, well, yeah, what I'd like to talk about is practical preparedness. And I decided to title the presentation Practically Prepared. I love the name. So anyway, I'm going to do a presentation in about a month at the local library. So this is legit in-person community, hopefully getting to spread the gospel of preparedness so that people realize, hey, it's not a bunch of crazy preppers living in a bunker with tinfoil hats. It's real world skills, things like copy canning, things like filling 2-liter pop bottles, things like rotating gas storage, things that almost cost you nothing extra that will give you peace of mind when all this shit is crumbling around you just a little bit, or even when you just think it is. So I'm excited. I'm stoked for that. I'm going to have it recorded. I'll end up posting it to the YouTube channel at some point. So to me, that's like one of the highlights of my year that I've never seen coming. So I will keep you guys updated on that, but I had to share it. Normally would have saved it for Saturday, but if you stuck with me for this long episode, this intense, I'm going to have a drink after. No, I'm just kidding. But this was fun. So guys, I know I tell you, and I've said it many times, that I started this channel, this content, back when I didn't have a community, but I treated it like I did. And now we have a community. We are a community. And thanks for coming in. I love doing this. There's very few things in the world that I enjoy as much as creating content, teaching, and sharing my passion with other people. So thanks for listening. So that's it for me this week, guys. Keep an eye out. I'm going to bring you some new items from the Prepper Museum collection here pretty soon. I'll tell you the story behind how I found each one. And yeah, that's it for this evening. Thanks for coming by, guys. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and have a great week.